Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy Podcast. This is the first episode in a series of episodes that I'm calling the History of the Papacy Podcast Remastered or Re-Engineered or something like that. I'm going to be working on re-releasing a bunch of the earlier episodes of the podcast. I'll include some new information, and these episodes, of course, will have better audio quality as well. I'm also going to reorganize their numbering into something that makes a bit more sense. Worry not, though, because this won't affect new episodes. New episodes and series will be coming out, too. So I hope you like these newly remastered episodes. I think that the between the audio quality, some extra material that will be added in there, and the reorganization will help them put into better context of how they fit with the entire History of the Papacy project, because I've been working on this since 2000, essentially very early 2012 to the middle of 2012. That's when I really started researching the podcast. And then I released the first episodes in January of 2013. So at this point in 2021, I've been working on this for a long time, and a lot has changed. It's taken me time to find my footing in podcasting, which I don't know if I have or not yet, but I think I found something of a footing, and I wanted these early episodes, they fit in with what I've been doing, but I want to put them into more of the organizational structure that I've developed. So the sidetrack episodes, they might be folded in with some of these episodes, but just keep your podcatchers tuned in because we will have many of them. So let me get on with a little bit of this is a remastering of the introductory episode. And a lot of what I wrote in 2013, 2012 still applies to this day, but of course with some changes. So this podcast is going to be, and it has been, an investigation and a discussion of the history of the popes of Rome, but not exclusively so. This podcast will talk about the Bible, the earliest church and church organization. I want to really attempt to lay out my basic premise here. The podcast is not necessarily a theological review, but we do discuss theology because theology is critical to understanding why people did the things that they did. Theology is just what people believed. And by talking and discussing theology, it's not like we're trying to convert people or do something like that. If you don't understand people's theology and the related topic of philosophy, then you don't understand what people are actually thinking and what's the motivation behind their actions. I will be taking, and I have taken, a purely historical perspective to the history of the popes of Roman Christian Church. And that being said, I will be talking about, and I have talked about, Christianity, Jesus, saints, the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, Protestant churches, the Bible. There's going to be references to priests, bishops, deacons, and all the sorts. So this is obviously unavoidable. Additionally, I haven't ever really picked one to go with, either the AD, the Anno Domini, or the BC, before Christ time marking period, or the CE, also the Common Era, or BCE, before the Common Era. I use both of them interchangeably. I like to pick and choose, and what can I say? I think in a way the argument over AD, BC versus BCE, CE can be a little silly, just because that was something that was not used by Christians even until, I believe, almost the Middle Ages in the Western Europe, and they didn't use it in the Eastern part of the Roman Empire for a long, long time, like millennia after that. They used the reckoning of the beginning of the foundation of Rome, ad urbe condita. So we really can't say that. I just don't think that this AD BC or CE BCE thing is a hill to die on, and I just don't really I guess you might say I don't really care about it. So I'll use whichever one I feel like at the moment. I probably lean more towards BCE, CE, but for effect, I might use AD. Anyway, as you well know, this podcast is definitely not a narrative that starts at some point, like with Peter, and continues to Pope Francis or beyond. The plan is, and my plan has always been, is to have multi-part series of several episodes that fall into a common era or time frame or topic. A time frame in papal history might be as short as a few years or as long as centuries. The papal bearded phase, which you can watch a History of the Papacy in 10 minutes video on, where almost every pope had a beard, was almost 200 years long. Now, this thematic approach seems an effective way to me to tie everything together and contextualize the rich history of the pontiffs of Rome and the Christian church together. We'll do biographical sketches of famous and influential popes. We'll definitely do that. And we'll contextualize major historical events that were happening at the same time, changes in the roles of the popes, politics, theology, and look into the institutions of the church. I kind of, I've always struggled with this approach because obviously the history of the Roman popes seems to very easily and naturally lend itself to the great man, top-down historical approach. All you'd have to do is start with Peter or Linus or something, then just move chronologically to Francis or whoever comes after him, or I can't do this any longer, whichever happens first. The chronological narrative approach certainly could work, and people do that. It's a really interesting way to go about it. But my goal for this podcast is to take detours down different paths and historical events, along with looking at individual popes. To me, the detours, side trips, and back alleys of the papacy and the church are fascinating and deserve a closer look. The first several podcasts in this episode are going to focus in on early church history, starting with St. Peter. Now, let's talk a little bit about sources. I use a wide variety of sources. I use the history of the popes. There's several books by that title, and they're biographies of individual popes. And I'd use piles and piles of other texts and websites. Early church texts is a really good one. But if you have some really specific comments or would like to know more about specific books that I've used or resources, definitely let me know, and I'd love to talk about these. And now a word from our sponsors. Here's some interesting facts about the Bishop of Rome. He holds, that's his main title, is Bishop of Rome, but he also has titles that he's accumulated over the years. His Holiness the Pope, Vicar of Jesus Christ, Successor to St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, Patriarch of the West, of the Servant of God, Primate of Italy, the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman Province, and Sovereign of the Vatican City State. Each of these titles are completely packed full of history and reach into nearly every facet of European and world history for the past 2,000-odd years. And I hope to delve into as many of those aspects as I can in detail. Even the name Pope itself is interesting. Pope derives from the Greek or Latin word papa, which is a diminutive form of father, essentially dad or daddy. And I mean, people still say papa to this day for their dad. The Bishop of Rome was and is not alone in being referred to as Pope either. There's a Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt, and he's known as the Pope of Alexandria. The name Pope, or the word Pope, is simple, but it carries a great deal of historical baggage. I love talking about this, these little itty bitty facts that add up to a huge thing. So really, why make a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christianity? Why are they so important that people would want to listen to a history podcast on the popes of Roman Christian Church. I think that that is an important topic because the popes are religious and political figures all wrapped up into one. In 2,000 years, their roles have changed significantly, but popes to this day still hold real temporal and religious power. When a pope travels to different countries, crowds of thousands, tens or even hundreds of thousands come to see him. People really care what he has to say on the important issues of the day and follow his teachings, and people have been doing this for a long time. I can't honestly think of any other office or person or institution that has had such an everyday effect on people's lives for such a long period of time. Finally, to wrap up this introductory episode, I also think an introduction is a good place to talk about my philosophy on podcasting and knowledge. This podcast has never been exhaustive, and my knowledge and understanding of the topic is not all-encompassing by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a historian. I don't have any advanced degrees in history or church history or anything like that, but I'm going to find the people who do, and I'm going to ask them the questions that we all have. And that's really why I just thoroughly enjoy this medium of podcasting. A person who puts out a podcast like me, who's not an expert, I'm relying a lot on the subject matter experts of who I'm consulting, but I'm still also looking at primary source documents. And so I'm putting together a layman's perspective for other laymen, but I'm also tapping into the scholars of the day. You'll see this many times again. I do as much as I can to talk to experts, and you'll see this in several series that I do, that I'm always trying to find out the experts and find out what's the cutting edge in the academy going on, because that's fascinating as well. So I'm going to make some errors. I've been called out on the errors, and I will fix them. I think you'll see a couple of episodes that I've done, if you go into the catalog, where I brought on experts to talk about the mistakes. And I think we all learn from our mistakes, and that's how we grow. But I do think in the end that this ability to make mistakes and fix them is the most powerful thing. The newspaper or your internet website, when they make a mistake, they might bury a correction somewhere at the bottom of a page or on a completely different unlinked site to the main article. And they don't want to own up to their mistakes at all in many cases. Much of what we call the so-called history programming on television today is fairly much garbage. Again, no corrections or even attempts at clarifying mistakes or misunderstandings. And it's a shame, too. There used to be so many great history documentaries on TV. One that I loved was called Mysteries in the Bible, and it was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. The woman who narrated the biblical passages was named Gene Simmons, Jean, not Gene for Gene. And that always cracked me up, Gene Simmons. Anyway, you'll see I often make a tangent or two, but I really think it was important to just lay out a little bit of my philosophy on education, so to speak, here, and that I'm an educator by trade, but not in the sense of a college professor. So I think that the style of education that I've had to do in my career actually might be better for this medium of podcasting than maybe somebody like a professor who is buried in a very content-specific area and is teaching for a very different outcome, I guess you might say. That's up. I would love to talk about that whole philosophy of education as well, but a different topic for a different day. Now, I hope you enjoy listening to the history of the papacy as much as I love making the history of the papacy. I think if you come and join me on this trip, it will be highly enjoyable and entertaining. If you want to discuss topics for future podcast episodes or debate the finer points of church and papal history, please find the podcast on Facebook and Twitter. I will update those quite frequently. Thank you for listening, and I hope to hear from you. I'd like to thank all our patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy. Go there to find a great way to support the show. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, I'd love to hear them. Send me a tweet, a Facebook message, or send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com, and I will talk to you next time on the History of the Papacy Podcast and the History of the Papacy Podcast Remastered.